Google has this program called I Am Remarkable. Anybody can go, it's open source, become an I Am Remarkable
Hmm.
facilitator and lead a workshop. And they created it because a lot of, especially women in their offices around the world, were having trouble talking about their accomplishments in performance reviews. Part of it cultural, part of it gender socialization. But they wanted to help them, quote unquote, brag, right? And recognize that talking about your accomplishments isn't bragging. So they have some presentations and they make a bunch of points. But the core part of it is, 'cause I went through it, I was curious, is you write down your accomplishments and then everybody goes around the room and they say, I am remarkable because, and you state one thing, reason why you're remarkable. My feedback to Google, and I've worked with them in the US and in Europe, is you need to change the name from I am remarkable to some days I suck. Right? So I'm remarkable and some days I suck, right? Because we're not gonna be remarkable all the time. We're not gonna be geniuses all the time. And it's this kind of huge setup if that's what we're expecting.
I'm Johnny, and I have our definition of the day. Imposter syndrome, as defined by Dr. Valerie Young's research, is a persistent belief that one's accomplishments are not genuine or deserved, often accompanied by a fear of being exposed as a fraud, despite clear evidence of competence and evidence of success. There's a couple things that I found very interesting about Dr. Young's perspective. One is it's not just a lack of confidence. That is a recurring theme we hear, and she emphasizes that very much. She emphasizes that imposter syndrome goes beyond episodic self doubt. It's a chronic pattern tied to unattainable expectations about what it means to be truly capable. And she delves into the five types as she explains it. She categorizes imposter feelings into five types based on competence styles. There's the perfectionist, the expert, the natural genius, the soloist, and the superhuman. Each of these has a distinct way of distorting what genuine competence should look like. So, in summary, Dr. Valerie Young's definition of imposter syndrome centers on the chronic inability to internalize achievement, fed by distorted beliefs about competence and accompanied by ongoing fear of exposure as a fraud, regardless of the evidence. If you love what we're doing, follow us on social and everywhere you get your favorite podcast. Let's dive in. Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.
I in looking through suggestions for guests, you often come up as the number one suggestion, other than Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. You are right there in that first slot. So it's an honor to have you here. I'm very interested in learning a little bit more about your work, a little more about your the institution that you run, and also just asking you a whole bunch of questions.
All right, I'm ready.
So first and foremost, tell us just a little bit about your work specific to imposter syndrome.
Sure, Johnny. Well, I started a long time ago. I actually did my original doctoral research on internal barriers to women's occupational achievement, where I interviewed professional women. Over half of the women in my sample were women of color, which was very atypical now, and it was even more, unusual back when I did the work. I'm not a psychologist, which I think really serves me in terms of imposter syndrome. So I immediately took the results of my findings, and I turned them into an educational intervention, and it didn't even occur to me until decades later, Johnny, that it probably was the first educational intervention for imposter syndrome. Everything prior to that, and for many people still, is one-on-one therapy. So I experienced it myself, which is how I got involved in the topic of imposter syndrome, started speaking about it, leading workshops on it, training coaches on it, training other speakers to deliver my talk, and wrote a book, and the rest is history.
So, you touched a little on it, but really, if I'm starting with why the Simon Sinek approach with you,
Yeah.
um, tell me what it really was that drew you to the topic.
Oh, it was 1,000% my experiencing it. I was in a class, in graduate school, by the way, at the same university where my mother also worked as a night janitor. And somebody brought in the paper by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, The Imposter Phenomenon Amongst High Achieving Women. and started describing this experience of feeling like you're in over your head and you're going to be found out and externalizing your accomplishments. And I was just kind of nodding my head like a bobblehead doll, right? Like, oh my God, that's me. And then I looked around the room and all the other graduate students were nodding their head. And we started a little imposter support group and started talking about our intellectual fraudulence and how we're fooling all of our professors. And after a few weeks, I started to have this nagging sense that even though everyone else was saying they were an imposter, it's like I knew I was the only real imposter, right? I was like the Beyonce of imposters. And so I really changed the whole focus of my doctoral research. I was on a whole different track and decided instead to look more. I didn't study imposter syndrome per se. I was more interested in like what might lead to these feelings. What are the kind of internal attitudes and behaviors that might lead to imposter feelings?
Mhm. You know, you and I have spoken before the podcast to go through some questions, and we've had a lot of guests that I guess you could say they've corrected me in some of my phrasing when I've used the term imposter syndrome. One of our previous guests, Dr. Terry Simkin, one of her taglines, it's not a bloody syndrome. And from a psychologist and I think that side of the profession point of view, and even uh, Dr. Clance, I had a very brief conversation with her, and she corrected me in saying, "Now you do know I originally called it imposter phenomenon, but I think you have an interesting take on that, don't you?"
I do. Actually, I was talking to Suzanne Ives, the other co-coiner, and she asked me like flat out, like she said, you have a lot of influence. Can you do something about this to like get people to not say imposter syndrome? And A, I am not that powerful. And B, I was actually asked to contribute a chapter to the first research-based book on imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome that was published by the American Psychological Association. And as I got, we got to the end, we're getting ready to publish. The APA said to me, by the way, could you not use the term imposter syndrome? Because that's like nails on the chalkboard, right? For psychologists and academics. And I said, "No, I refuse to change it." And Kevin Coakley, University of Michigan, who's the editor, he said, "Oh, I understand, it's your brand," because I've had the domain impostersyndrome.com since 1995. I said, "No, this is not about my brand, right? It's not about my brand." That people often mistakenly attribute the term imposter syndrome to me. I didn't come up with it, but I did have the Library of Congress kinda look into it. They did some research to go back as far as we could with was on microfiche and things, and really just a few years after Clance and Imes coined the term imposter phenomenon in 1978, it started being kind of morphed into being called imposter syndrome, including by some other academic studies. So I wrote quite a long footnote in my chapter to explain how I wasn't gonna change it, and the reason was that I think it comes down to your frame of reference. For psychiatrists, psychologists, people in the mental health field, their frame of reference is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual. That's where they go to look up mental disorders and, mental health conditions. I think for the vast majority of us who are not in those fields, our frame of reference is the dictionary. And the dictionary also describes imposter syndrome as a set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that constitute a pattern. Or I shouldn't say they define imposter syndrome, but the word syndrome also can refer to a set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that constitute a pattern, which I think perfectly describes imposter feelings. So I kind of compromised throughout the everybody called it IP in the chapter, capital letter IP, because that's like shorthand. So I compromised and I said IP/IS. But I said that it would be disingenuous for me after 40 years to stray from a term that I've used responsibly for 4 decades. And that, you don't get to own, right? There's another definition of it was essentially what I was saying.
I love that, and I think we talk a lot about I use the term utility, and does it have utility or does it not? And I understand from the orientation of the psychologist, yes, it's not a syndrome,
Yeah.
and in some ways it's maybe it's not an either or, it's a both and. One thing I definitely like about the syndrome phrasing is that as you cover specifically and as is recurrent and probably one of my larger frustrations in conversation with people when we talk about imposter feelings, imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome, um, is the over democratization of it. The term everyone experiences it drives me nuts. And I'm not credentialed. I don't have a PhD in psychology. I'm an interloper in many ways. But I do think that that term syndrome has utility. It has usefulness in setting it aside and saying, "No, not everyone does experience this." It seemed futile for me to spend too much time in that stuck in that argument, but given this opportunity to discuss it this way, my true feelings are, syndrome is a useful term, and I think you've given me the courage to stick with it.
Okay. Well, when I started using it, it occurred a couple times in my dissertation along with imposter phenomena. And I was not aware, because I'm not in psychology, I wasn't aware of how it was perceived in the field of psychology. So, I can't go back in time and look at what was in my head, but I'm quite sure that, I looked at it like that imposter thing. Syndrome being that imposter thing,
Yeah.
that happens. So, yeah, but just to be clear, it is not, nor has it ever been a diagnosable mental health, mental disorder of any sort whatsoever.
How about this? Let's make let's make an arrangement in some ways with the world that if we can get this darn thing in the DSM, maybe, and just maybe, we'll revisit that word syndrome.
Yeah, I don't wanna see it at the DSM, but that's another whole conversation.
Well, I find it fascinating, and I do think that we of the guests that I've had, there are layers of expertise that we've had some great and deep conversations. I will say just around the terminology, this is probably one of the more compelling conversations. And honestly, it's more in alignment with some of the things that I believe in. I felt in some ways just lost around, I don't even know what to call it. We joked about it early on that I don't even know if it's OR or ER imposter in the spelling.
And both are
Um,
correct, which is odd, but yeah.
well, I think you've given me a little bit of a compass to stick with some of my feelings about it. And that word syndrome, I don't know, it seems important. It seems
Well,
important.
then let's stick with it.
So we talked a little bit. There's a lot of people that are joining the chorus of voices out there that are talking about imposter phenomenon syndrome. Um, there's a lot of people that are trying to help, trying to make change, trying to educate. Let's talk about the sinister side of that. How does society, how does family, how does workplace, and those cultures that are contained actually reinforce imposter feelings?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be reinforced in many different ways. One way you mentioned organization, right? Organizational culture. And by that, I mean kind of the overarching culture, like higher education, academia has this overarching culture. It doesn't matter whether you're going to go attend or teach at Harvard or, University of Southern Florida. It's going to bring with it this kind of culture of critique. Now I'm talking here about, kind of on the faculty level and the doctoral student level where your work is subject to peer review. It's all about cutting down your arguments and pointing out the flaws in other people's work. So very much a cultural critique. And then you have medicine, which is very much a culture of shaming folks for not knowing the answer. So why I think it's important to understand that is that if you're in either one of those settings, you might think it's me, right? I do all this work on this paper, I submit it, and I get is these, comments in the margins about, all the work it needs and all the problems with it. Nobody's saying, well-crafted paragraph, interesting observation, right? They're only telling you what you're doing wrong. And again, and in medicine, you're only hearing what you're doing wrong. Very little praise is happening there. So the point that I make to folks in those areas is you didn't know that was the culture you were signing up for when you went into medicine or higher ed, but that's the culture you're in. So once you know that, you can do less personalizing and more contextualizing. I think if you're in an environment where there's a lot of expectations around perfectionism, or if you're in an environment where there's a lot of very highly educated people, and there's some snobbery around that. I spoke at Apple, and they said internally, they refer to them as genius jerks. Which I can totally picture as well, right? So, there are people whose mission it is to make other people feel lesser or feel, quote, unquote, "stupid," so that can get reinforced out in the world. Parents unintentionally, one of the questions I ask my audience is, "How many of you were raised by humans?" I wanna see a show of hands. I let the record show the majority of us were. But even real well-intentioned human parents, they were raised by humans and all down the line, they can transmit some messaging that might lead a child to go up and have imposter feelings later in life. So, there's lots of places where it gets reinforced.
Some of the reinforcement I heard there was just sort of inherent, intrinsic, almost subconscious isn't the right term, but from an organizational standpoint, they're not in opposition to imposter feelings. They're not out there saying specifically, we're going to do everything we can to trigger these imposter syndrome feelings, but it's inherent in there. Let's talk a little bit about once it's identified, once the words are out there and someone says imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, what has your experience been with the way that culture minimizes it once it's identified?
Yeah. Um, well, I think it's a funny timing. I just got back from being on this trip to Greenland and Northern Labrador, and Margaret Atwood was on the ship, the author who wrote, among many other books, *Handmaid's Tale*.
Yeah.
And she had an ask me anything session, and I should have known better because I had a quick conversation with her the night before. And she's very confident. I saw a documentary that we got to watch on the ship, um, about her early days at Ratcliffe, and she just was always like the brightest person and just very confident. So I raised my hand and I said, my Angela said I've written 11 books, and every time I write another one, I think, uh-oh, I pulled another one over on everyone, and they're going to find out. Like, what would your advice be to other creative people? Because it's also very common amongst creatives, writers, and actors, and so on. And her advice was to suck it up. I'm like, "Okay, this is not helpful." It's like, "You're depressed, just suck it up." Um, but on the other hand, I mean, I should not have put her in that position. This is not her area of expertise, and it also was very much in keeping with her very solid confidence. So for her, I mean, she put up with a lot of crap in the 1960s being a woman getting a PhD at Radcliffe, who they didn't take seriously at all. So I can see where "suck it up" would be her, frame of reference. But I think what a lot of people do is they end up, if they don't tell you to suck it up, they tell you they give you a pep talk, right? "Oh, come on, Johnny, you can do this and you deserve to be here," which all of which is true. But, if all it took was a pep talk, there would be no imposter syndrome. It's really not enough to move the needle in any lasting way.
There was an event here in Nashville called Brain Trust. It's an incredible event.
Yeah.
A local industry titan in the real estate space is one of the heads of it, and there was a panel, and I'm not sure who was on the panel or actually who was the person that said it, but I had someone reach out directly to me, and they said I was at Brain Trust and imposter syndrome came up, and the person said like they hated it and it's just a made up phony term.
Yeah.
um, and she reached out to me because she said that doesn't feel true to me because of the way I feel, what I experience. And this lady specifically said that she's never felt anything like it. And sort of like, I've never felt it, therefore it can't exist. And I hope I don't get an angry phone call from whoever the person was that actually said this on stage. Um, but even if I do, I'd love to have that conversation. But
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to have the conversation.
and this is a dangerous question. I have to be very careful on how I ask this, but of the people that I have seen vehemently stating no, it's not, it's bullshit, it seems to be a female voice. Is that
Yeah.
is
Yeah, that's happening more and more, and part of it, occurred when, Harvard Business Review had an article called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome," and it was written by 2 women of color who, kind of pushed back on the original. I don't wanna say research, 'cause what Clancynimes, their concept of imposter phenomenon didn't come out of a study. It came out of observations of women in private therapy or in personal growth groups, but they're all white women. So there was some pushback on, this concept that was it's about white women, being extended to everyone. They really talked about how organizations, contribute to imposter feelings and make you feel less than, whether it's not, valuing your input or not promoting folks or whatever that might be. All of which, I have absolutely no argument with. But it kind of led to them saying, it's just a made up concept. It's not even real, and we should not even talk about it anymore. So I think that they're absolutely right in addressing that it's not all in your head, right? There's ways that we're, especially if you're one of the first, the few, or the only, person of color, person with a disability, someone with a working class or regional accent. You're the first generation in your family to go to college. But I mean, anybody who's on the receiving end of stereotypes, specifically about competence or intelligence, is going to be more susceptible to imposter feelings. And if you're the first, the few, or the only, the first, senior vice president to have an obvious disability, or you're the youngest, right? Um, that in and of itself can contribute to this feeling of this pressure to have to represent your entire group and to constantly kind of push back on stereotypes. So they were absolutely right about that, but it kind of morphed into it's not real, it's made up. It's just New Yorker did an article and somebody talked about it being kind of a white lady thing, and it was a white woman who said that. In fact, it was interesting, Johnny, I went back and looked at my dissertation and I cited these two Asian American researchers from UC Berkeley in the School of Education. One was the associate dean at the time, the other one was a doctoral student. 2 years before Clance and Imes gave it a name, they had done interviews with, second generation Chinese American women and women in Japan, so also outside of the US, basically describing the exact same phenomena, that they felt like frauds, they were dismissing their accomplishments, etcetera. So, it's not a, quote, "white lady thing." It's prevalent amongst, folks of color and, a lot of different people from a lot of different areas. But that's kinda, I think, how that all that started.
I At the risk of sounding like a smartass, I think my first response to the statement of it's a made up concept would be, isn't that what all concepts are? That's what makes it a concept, that it's a construct, it's a concept. Um, and I do think that one of the more powerful terms specific to some of the things you were mentioning, Dr. Jill Stoddard, when she was on the show, she used the term, if you've ever been othered, and she used, I think otherism may have been one of the other, components, and, she said, "Look, this is also kind of a made up term, but I'm gonna throw it out there because it's useful." If you have ever been othered, and personally, I've always wondered, as a straight white male over the age of 50, he's like, "From where do I pull my authority to even be having these conversations?" And I think the other component of it, what I realized was it was a blue collar raising
Mhm.
that, what especially it was really exacerbated when I got into white collar work because I was literally sitting across from MBAs and it's like, I could drive a forklift until like last year. That was the only accreditation I have. And so I do find that the term othered or otherism, it seems to be a recurring theme. And I think the two ladies that were writing about it earlier on, it keeps going back to that we can debate it, but it has too much usefulness to drive out.
Yeah.
Don't live in the victimhood of it. I would agree completely. Use it as a way to strengthen yourself. But
Yeah, and I also add, that on some level, we all know what it's like to be underestimated because of stereotypes. So, a question I often ask my audience is, how many of you have ever felt underestimated because you were the youngest person in an achievement arena? Like, everybody has experienced that. How many of you have ever been the oldest person and felt underestimated? And when I ask that question to Facebook employees, the 30-year-olds raise their hand, right? So it's all relative. Again, it goes in terms of othering, truly, yeah, again, to different degrees, we've all experienced what it's like to experience stereotypes around competence and intelligence. I mean, that's not the only source, but They're right to have raised that, but I strongly disagree with the end kind of analysis there that we should stop talking about it. There was also, and I'm gonna not remembering her name at the moment, there was a woman who did a, commencement speech at Smith College a few years ago and got huge amount of social media, from this, where she said it was a scam, that's a misogynistic scheme to kinda keep women down. Got all her dates wrong. She said, funny how it came up right around Roe v. Wade, funny how it came up right around Title IX, and both of those things happened, well before, the term imposter phenomena came along. So there was just a lot of inaccuracies. I wrote a long article pushing, here's where I agree, here's where I strongly push back. So it's become, I think, needlessly this kind of controversial issue, but again, important to have these conversations at the same time.
Hey, if people are talking about it,
Right, right,
that's the big thing. And the first person that explained it to me, or really they didn't explain anything. They asked me a simple question. Have you ever heard of imposter syndrome? And I've said this many times on the show. It was as though someone reached in and just twisted a lens,
yeah,
and so much of my life came in focus. And I don't want to give that up. If there's utility in this topic, let's not
right,
throw the baby out with the bathwater. Understanding that the term syndrome being applied, there's been conversations even here on the show that were related to, well, it's misogynistic because it's, largely female, and that term syndrome seemed to be slapped on it, hysteria, and the origin of that term was maybe folded in. And again, as long as we're talking about it, who cares? Let's argue and debate, but we're
right.
not throwing the baby out with the bathwater on this one, I don't think.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's somebody actually put on, LinkedIn, "Is imposter syndrome the new female hysteria?" Which I thought, A, they don't understand the origins of the word hysteria and hysterectomy, and that's why they did hysterectomies to take the hysteria out of women. But it was all going back to, like, it was a white woman saying, "This is the new white women, hysteria." So a lot of that came from those narratives. It's real. It has impacts and cost and implications, not just for individuals, but also for organizations, which is why I speak at so many organizations, because they understand that it's not just an interesting self-help topic.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I think it's important that anyone talking about it needs to orient towards some version of self-improvement, mental health component. Like it has to be positive. It's not about living in victimhood. It's really not about the thing itself. It's about the tools, the tactics, the strategies. So give us some practical strategies in your day-to-day work that you found most effective for maybe reframing some of those imposter thoughts.
Sure. Well, I think fundamentally it comes down to, first of all, kind of normalizing imposter syndrome by, in my view, I think it's been over psychologized, that we do need to step back and look at what I describe as the perfectly good reasons why someone might feel like a fraud, to kind of flip the question from why do I feel like an imposter to how could you not? Given, again, folks in certain occupations are more susceptible. Situational factors like as a subset of the population, college students and especially doctoral students, postdocs are much more likely to have imposter feelings than other
Mm.
folks. People who work alone might be more susceptible. There's a societal aspect that we just talked about. There's family messages, organizational culture. But in my view, if all of those things were solved or kind of disappeared tomorrow, but we kept our unrealistic, unsustainable expectations around what it means to be competent, then nothing would change. So, my mantra is the only way to stop feeling like an imposter, which of course is what everyone wants, is to stop thinking like an imposter because feelings are the last to change. So, I'm trying to shift people from feeling like an imposter to being someone I refer to as a humble realist. If you take that, it's inaccurate, but it's often thrown out there that 70% of the people have these feelings, right? So, but if we take that general concept, like if the majority of people have these feelings, my question is like, what's up with the other 30? Like, why aren't we studying with them? Well, another narrative that's coming out is the other 30, like that they're either arrogant or they're incompetent. right? And so we don't wanna do that, right? So we better keep our imposter syndrome. It must be a superpower, better, because we don't wanna be arrogant or incompetent. And I think that's a false choice. This idea that you can be an arrogant, incompetent jerk, or you can keep your imposter feelings. And I really encourage people to embrace a third option, a healthier option, which is to become what I call a humble realist. Somebody who is genuinely humble, genuinely intelligent, capable, competent, but has never had imposter feelings because they think differently, and that's truly the only difference between them and us.
So there's Dunning-Kruger on one side, there's imposter, and then there's this little sliver in the middle that, how, how wonderful that must be to not be fettered with the type of consistent and chronic, to use your term, self-doubt. Um, so, talking through as a tool for self-betterment, the conversations that are going on, and one of the more fascinating statistics is that the high level, and I'm not even gonna attempt to quote because it seems to change every day, but within leaders specifically, um, why is it so high? Why is it such a prevalent thing among C-level executives, politicians, civic leaders, religious leaders? Like, what
Yeah.
is it? What's there?
Well, I on the one hand, I wanna dispel the idea that it's only affects high achievers because I think it holds people back who could go further were it not for these, chronic self-doubt and imposter feelings specifically. But, when you are successful in those ways, you're more vulnerable. There's farther to fall. There's higher expectations. There's more scrutiny. So, and especially if you are a very senior leader, there's also, they say it's lonely at the top, right? There's that kind of isolation, and you feel like you can't ask people, you can't get help. You can't ask questions. Everything's weighted on your shoulders. For folks who have degrees, whether it's MD or PhD, somebody said to me, I think it was the University of Michigan, they said, "This is ridiculous. I shouldn't feel like an imposter. I have a PhD." And I said, "No, you feel like an imposter because you have a PhD."
Mm.
Right now, people look at you a certain way. They have certain expectations. Oh, you must be, smart. So I think that there's additional pressure there. And we bought into the idea that the more credentialed I get, the more experienced, the more successful, like that's the fix. Then I won't feel like an imposter. And really just the opposite tends to happen.
So I think there's a subset of just naturally born humble realists. Um, for those of us that aren't, what are some of the tools and practices that can help us kind of shift away from that imposter thinking into what may be not a natural state for us, but something that we could maybe adopt and live in and experience, even if just sporadically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it'd be very interesting to find out, like, how did they get there? Did they come out of the womb? Like that. I mean, parents tell me, they'll have one kid who just, is tormented by perfectionism at, 6 years old, and the other kid's just infinitely confident that they can do anything, better than anybody. So who knows? Maybe we're kinda hardwired that way. Um, but what I find is that there's 3 key differences, the 3 specific areas where humble realists think differently is they have, number 1, a realistic understanding of competence, and that includes a healthy respect for their limitations. Google has this program called I Am Remarkable. Anybody can go, it's open source, become an I Am Remarkable
Mm.
facilitator and lead a workshop. And they created it because a lot of, especially women, in their offices around the world were having trouble talking about their accomplishments in performance reviews. Part of it cultural, part of it gender socialization, but they wanted to help them, quote unquote brag, right? And recognize that talking about your accomplishments isn't bragging. So they have some presentations and they make a bunch of points, but the core part of it is, 'cause I went through it, I was curious, is you write down your accomplishments, and then everybody goes around the room and they say, "I am remarkable because," and you state one thing, reason why you're remarkable. My feedback to Google, and I've worked with them in the US and in Europe, is you need to change the name from I'm remarkable to some days I suck. Right? So I'm remarkable and some days I suck, right? Because we're not gonna be remarkable all the time. We're not gonna be geniuses all the time, and it's this kinda huge setup if that's what we're expecting. So, I always tell people I'm really good at, like, 3 things, I'm pretty good at 4 or 5 things, and I suck at everything else, and I'm good with that, right? So, having a realistic understanding of competence is, like, the strengths, but also, you know, letting ourselves off the hook for the stuff that we're not gifted or good at and don't have any interest in being good at. The other way they think differently is they have a healthy response to failure, mistakes, setbacks, and constructive feedback, which we experience as criticism. And they also understand that a certain amount of fear and self doubt is just part of the achievement journey. In other words, they're not conflating confidence and competence to think, well, if I was really competent, I feel confident 24/7. And my response is like, good luck with that. Right. You can still you can have normal anxiety before you're gonna make a presentation or go into a job interview or, whatever the big moment is. It's okay, to have some anxiety, and that's perfectly normal. It doesn't mean that you are an imposter. It's not proof of your ineptness that you have the fear.
You've mentioned several several times things that force us to look at the other 30%, or to pivot from what I'm remarkable at to what I suck about, where I suck, or how you put it. And I think you bring up something that is really important, and could actually help in some of these conversations around imposter syndrome, is that don't get stuck in just that. If 70% of us feel it, we could spend all of our time and just stay there. But what type of what type of findings might be there if we just look at the other 30%? What might we learn in that regard? And I think that's interesting.
It's probably more like the other I don't even know, 10% because let me be clear, there is a part of that 30% who does have irrational self-confidence syndrome, right? Whose belief in their knowledge and skills far exceeds their actual knowledge and skills. And then there's the proverbial kind of smartest guy in the room who is competent, but is, arrogant. They don't experience imposter syndrome because of their arrogance. But there's that minority within the minority that I'm describing as a humble realist. And I think it'd be very, very interesting to look at some research because when presented with the exact same situation that may make you or I, have this imposter moment, they're thinking different thoughts, which I think is really good news because it means we have to change ourselves, which feels exhausting. We just have to kind of collectively change our understanding of what it means to be competent and what it doesn't mean to be competent.
Hmm. This is going to be a little bit of a major shift, but in some of the organizations that you've worked with, I hear there's some larger tech organizations. You mentioned Google, you
Mm.
mentioned Apple. I'm in technology, or was in technology, still am in technology. Um, there's a lot of shifts right now,
Yeah.
and with whether it be work from home, I mean, we can. This is the longest conversation I've been in the day where AI hasn't come up in like the first 5 minutes. But specifically, like the work from home component, what is that doing to people that experience imposter?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's been research on it. I know the Wall Street Journal did an article on it. They interviewed me for maybe 2 years ago or something. I just from a common sense perspective, I think for people who don't have any experience with their team, they've never met them in person, that if everything's virtual, it is harder to build that team. It's harder to read body language. It's easier to kind of get in your head. And that's true for people who work alone as well, because there's no one to get feedback from or bounce ideas off of and those kinds of things. But certainly that can contribute. And also in tech right now, well, first of all, anybody in information dense, rapidly changing fields like science, medicine, technology, you're going to see larger, higher rates of imposter feelings. But also, there's so much uncertainty in tech right now. And the game is changing and folks being laid off that, I think, folks are feeling some anxiety to they should also do more contextualizing of that and less personalizing.
Mm. Yeah, I think, I've only seen this one other time in my career where there's so much fear of technology, and this was late late 90s, the adoption of the internet, things were changing at such a rapid pace that people just couldn't catch up, and there was a similar, um, uh, almost apocalyptic level of thinking that, this is gonna be the end of something, end of a thing, and then someone gave me an article, and I think it was Melville, maybe, that wrote about this incredible technology that was going to completely destroy the family dynamic, and it was the stove. And he was basically saying if we no longer have a hearth and we have these stoves, it's going to eliminate something. And maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But I think this is not a recurring theme, the fear, but I've not seen it so concentrated in probably the past 30 years. And so, yeah, that definitely is something that's gonna trigger imposter, for people that are non-technical
Right,
specifically.
right, yeah.
What are you seeing there specifically? Is there any studies being done on that?
I'm not aware that there's studies being done, specifically, but I think, again, from a common sense perspective, as things get more complex and there's a feeling of I can't keep up and I'm on perpetual overwhelm, right, and overload, that it's harder to think, it's harder to act, and therefore it's easier to start questioning our abilities and competence.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a segue here that I wanna grab onto, and I think I need to frame the question the right way. Um, from your opinion, social media and its impact for people with feelings of imposter syndrome. What are your thoughts there?
Well, 2 things. I think it's easier for misinformation to be spread quickly. I get the Google alerts whenever the term imposter syndrome comes up. And there's some like ridiculous, some women went to a nudist retreat and they were walking through the lobby and they said they had imposter syndrome in the hotel lobby. I'm like, no, you were naked in a hotel lobby. That's the syndrome you had. Right. So a lot of misinformation or, again, the dismissing imposter syndrome and those kind of thing. But it also, never at any point in history have we had so much opportunity to compare ourselves with other people. And, it can seem like everyone else is living their best life except for us. It can appear that everyone's successes are kind of effortless because you're not seeing the struggle. I mean, and I know people who they were trying to establish themselves as, various, lifestyle experts and living the good life and being on these islands, and they were like they had no money, and then behind the scenes, a whole different thing was going on, a lot of anxiety, but so there's a lot of projection that we're seeing out there, and if you don't recognize it for what it is, you can start comparing yourself to other people. I spoke at MIT, I've spoken there a number of times, which initially can be intimidating, right? They don't even have names of the buildings, they're numbered, which is very MIT. But one of the last times I spoke there, after I was gonna be there, they announced, like, in 3 weeks, they were gonna have a panel with 3 very prestigious professors to talk about their very best failures and what they learned from them. And I understand the room was packed because I think that people are hungry to not just hear the success story, but to hear about the struggle and the perseverance and, how we overcame and pushed through adversity and difficulty and challenge, not just the success story, which is what you see in social media.
One of the after that lens twist when I first heard the term and as I dug in and did research and tried to educate myself better and learn from people that have spent time and focus on the topic. Probably one of the first things that was an outcome from that was a better understanding and a better relationship for me personally with failure. I think that
Mhm.
was something that, the imposter component failure was I mean, it was very binary. There was no gray. It was
Right,
failure's death, and
right.
and that's not healthy, of course. And so I think you bring up a great um, you bring up a great thing that the ways that some of the conversations around imposter syndrome are helping people that have intrinsically hard time dealing with failure. That could be one of the first. That could be one of the first things that you grapple with is
Absolutely,
relationship with failure.
yep, failure, difficulty, challenge, setback, constructive feedback. There's this guy, Mike Massimino. He's a NASA astronaut, or he's retired now. I heard him on a podcast, and he used to be on The Big Bang Theory playing himself. And he was talking about how in his first, deployment on one of the shuttles, he experienced imposter syndrome. So I read his book about his unlikely journey growing up working class kid on Long Island and achieving his lifelong dream of becoming a NASA astronaut. I read his whole book. I happened to be speaking at Columbia University to graduate students in the afternoon of the only day in the morning where he had office hours. So I wanna meet this guy. So I emailed him, "Mike, I'm gonna be around. Can I meet with you?" I don't hear anything. Right? So I could have taken that really personally, but then instead I thought, well, perhaps he didn't understand. So I sent him a copy of my book because it's harder to ignore a package in the mail, right, with a note in it. So he emailed me like one line, "Yeah, I'll meet with you," right? So I meet with him and I said, "Mike, I read your book and I don't think you had imposter syndrome." He said, "You don't?" I said, "No, I think you had holy crap, I'm going into outer space in a tin can syndrome." And the reason I said that, Johnny, is his whole book is a case study in humble realist thinking. When he was at MIT, he got an 18 in one exam, he got a 20 in another exam, he got, like, the lowest grades in the class, and he was crushingly disappointed. I mean, you're not happy when these things happen, right? But almost dropped out, but instead, he got together with another failing student, and they formed a study group, and they were able to raise their grades together. Then he failed his qualifying oral exam to go on to get the PhD. And again, crushingly disappointed, almost dropped out, but he did more research. People helped him prepare for the barrage of questions he was going to get from his committee. And he had 6 months and he went back and retook it. And his whole book, it's all these about setbacks and adversity and what he did with it. So, I know he's saying he experienced imposter syndrome. I think, again, he was nervous because he was going to go up into outer space because to me, he really represented, humble, realist thinking and a healthy response to these challenges.
Yeah, sometimes we are out over our skis. Sometimes we are um, completely out of our element. And one of our guests, Chris Kelso, he used the term uh, self-esteem versus self-efficacy.
Uh-huh.
And as he unpacked that and got into what that meant to him, self-esteem is more about the emotional component where I believe that imposter lives, and that side's not going to go away. You can't ration with it because it's irrational. Maybe you can a little bit, maybe you can negotiate it. But on the self-efficacy side, he says if you can get over into that thinking, it's a little bit more empirical. Do I have experience? If I don't have experience, do I at least have experience in figuring out
Absolutely.
the way to it? And I found that also very useful.
Right, right.
Um, so I've got so two more questions um, to get us wrapped up. The last one's going to be a bit of a doozy, but this one you've probably already said this, but if I haven't asked the question directly, so what I'm going to ask is, what is a piece of advice that you have for someone who just realized that or just found their way to the term imposter syndrome? There's people that are experiencing it out there for the first time. The word's getting around. More people are becoming aware. Let's say Joe finds it for the first time. What's one piece of advice that you can give to Joe to help him navigate?
Well, I think it's to get accurate information,
Mhm.
to, talk about it, and not in that confessional kind of like, "Oh my god, I feel like an imposter," but a very kind of normal, offhanded way. It's to take a look, step back, kinda get the view from 20,000 feet and look at, what's your situation? What's your occupation? What the family message is? What's the organizational culture, any societal factors? In other words, to again, flip that question from, "Why do I feel like an imposter?" to, "How could I not under the circumstances?" I have a friend who's a therapist, and she had a student. He's a international student from Germany, and he's getting a doctorate. And she's spending like weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks trying to find this core family wound. And I'm like, Lynn, why don't you just say to him, "You're a PhD student, and you're and you're studying in a language that's not your first language. Like, why don't you contextualize it for him? Like, of course you feel like an imposter, right?" So do some more less personalizing, more contextualizing. Again, reframe competence, failure, mistakes, and fear. And then I think the biggest thing, Johnny, is a lot of people are kind of waiting until they feel more confident, and then they'll stretch or whatever it might be for them. And that's not how it works. Again, you got to change your thoughts first and then act like you believe the new thoughts, even though you don't, right? Somebody's raised their hand at the end of a talk and said, "This is great, but what if, you tell yourself all these things, but you don't believe the new thoughts?" And my response is, "Oh, no, you won't believe the new thoughts. Like, trust me, you will not believe the new thoughts, but you have to act like somebody who did believe the new thoughts." And then over time, the confidence and the feelings will start to catch up.
Yeah, the Kurt Vonnegut, my favorite author, said you sometimes you have to jump off a cliff and grow wings on the way down. And I think I like your version a little bit better because it's more like, okay, get yourself ready, have that understanding, and at least you're able to intellectualize it, even if you can't completely feel the experience of,
Yep,
perfect confidence. Go ahead and act as if. But it does require that understanding, or it can be, it could really be that almost it could kick you right back to the beginning.
mhm, mhm.
So I love that answer. And then here comes the doozy. This one I've not asked a guest, but I think you've spent so much time and focus learning and teaching and educating and changing this conversation around this thing we call imposter syndrome. So looking forward, uh, 25, 30, 50 years in the future, what are a couple of changes that you would like to see just get ingrained into the conversation to where they lock in that might be helpful as we navigate this really sometimes blurry and complicated and problematic discussion? What are three things that if we change this about the discussion, this is a better path?
Yeah, I think, again, fundamentally, I have to keep coming back to, how do you, create environments and how do you reinforce humble realist thinking so that it is the kind of go-to, solution and the go-to, approach that individuals can take and organizations can take. A while back, there was somebody in Canada, I think, who started, like, a failure camp for kids. A question I often get from parents who attend my sessions is, what are some things parents can do so their kids don't go up and have imposter feelings? And I recommend Carol Dweck's solution, which is the typical dinner time conversation with school age kids is, "What did you learn in school today?" To which they say, "Nothing," or "I don't remember," which is what we said, by the way. And she said, "Wouldn't it be more useful if once a day, once a week, once a month, you went around the table and said, 'Let's all talk about something that was difficult or challenging or we failed at and how we dealt with it.' I'll start."
Mm,
So,
that
we wanna be trained in kind of resilience and, non-perfectionism and those kind of things. And it kinda goes back to you mentioned this, touched on the beginning, but I just wanna highlight the 5 competence types. And if folks Google what are the 5 types of imposters, they're not really types, they're not personalities, they're not archetypes, but that's my work, and there's like 2,000,000 searches. It's not always represented accurately out there, but that's you mentioned it, the perfectionist, the expert, the natural genius, the soloist, and the superhuman. These are different variations, different ways we inaccurately measure our competence. So back to, like, that person who's starting out, trying to understand, that's a good place to start as well. How am I looking at what it means to be competent? How am I measuring my competence, which is a big setup for feeling like an imposter.
mm. I said the last question. I do have one. This one's
Oh,
probably
sorry,
easier.
gotta go. Like, just kidding.
This one is much easier. We there are many voices there are other folks out there working on things. Who would you say is someone you admire and respect in the field that speaks specifically to the imposter phenomenon, syndrome, imposterism? What's a book we should go get? Who's someone that you admire in their conversations?
I think it is because most people are getting their information on the internet, and even people with psychology degrees are getting stuff wrong. There's some very well-known, mental health websites, counseling websites, like, very well known, that their claim to fame is that all their stuff is vetted, all their articles is all vetted by a mental health professional, and they constantly get my stuff wrong. It's like, did anybody even, like, bother to look? Um, so what was your question again?
Well, do you have a peer that you would recommend?
Oh, somebody I'd recommend, great. Well, actually, that's a good learning moment because I completely couldn't remember the question, but, I think not being afraid to just go like, what the hell are we talking about
Yeah,
now?"
right,
But I
right.
wanna that's a very human kind of response. So I would take a look at if you really wanna look at, like, the actual research, like, what's being done, I would look at that book called The Imposter Phenomenon, because there's all different chapters from a lot of different people from India, folks looking at, largely, Hispanic colleges and looking at it from so many different lenses that would be a good place to start. And Kevin Coakley is the editor of that book. So he's obviously very knowledgeable. Although Kevin and I, we disagree. I said in my book, I'll tell you this, a lot of people, their technique is to have their clients or friend like make a list of all of your accomplishments. And I said in my chapter that exercise doesn't have lasting value. And he was like, "What? I tell everybody to do that." And now he tells his audiences, "This is what I used to say. Here's what Valeria, why she's saying it doesn't work." And he wrote to me and said, "There's a lot of head nodding going on." So what I love about Kevin, he's also open to learning new things as well, but he's incredibly knowledgeable, especially around racialized imposter syndrome. So it's Kevin Coakley at University of Michigan.
We will be hitting him up to be a guest on the show for
Yep.
sure.
Tell him I sent you.
Well, I'll start by saying thank you for the work that you've done on this very critical, very important topic. Personally, the way that it's impacted my life, from the negative, from being unaware of it, and then the journey from having awareness and using the tools and the strategies and the tactical items that people like yourself are out there building. Just thank you for the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being a guest on the Impodsters, and I want to say thank you on behalf of our listeners. I hope I hope someone reaches out to me specifically to talk about you. To that end, we'll have in the notes we'll have links to Dr. Young's books and some of her works. We'll reference some of the items that we've discussed here today. So, Dr. Young, again, thank you for today.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Johnny.